Somewhere in the Utah desert, over 12,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers sat around a small fire. It was the end of the last ice age. Mammoths were still alive, somewhere out there on the same continent. And these people sitting around that fire were doing something you've probably done yourself, or at least seen someone else do. They were smoking. Not cigarettes, obviously. Not anything you'd recognize by brand or package. But the plant itself. The same plant, more or less, sitting in gas stations and convenience stores today. Tobacco. And the fact that we know this at all comes down to 4 tiny burned seeds sitting in the ashes of a fire that went out more than 12,000 years ago and somehow survived long enough for someone to find them. This video is about that discovery, and one more just like it, from a completely different continent, thousands of years later. Because between the two of them, they tell you something surprising about how far back this specific human habit, inhaling burning plant matter on purpose, actually goes. And in at least one case, it's not the plant you'd expect. Let's start with that Utah site, because the story of how it was found is almost as interesting as what was found there. Archaeologists call it the Wishbone Site, out in the Great Salt Lake Desert. It's a harsh, dry, mostly featureless stretch of land today. But 12,300 years ago, when the last ice age was still winding down, this exact spot was a marshy wetland, sitting near a lake that no longer exists in the same form. A team led by archaeologist Darren Duke had been excavating the remains of an ancient hearth there, a small fire pit used by hunter-gatherers passing through. Around that fire pit, they found stone tools, spear tips, and the bones of waterfowl and small mammals, clearly the remains of a meal, cooked right there thousands of years ago. And mixed into the ash, they found something much smaller. 4 charred seeds. Under a microscope, those seeds turned out to belong to a specific plant, Nicotiana attenuata, a wild variety of tobacco that still grows across parts of the American West today. Here's where it gets interesting. This particular wetland wouldn't have been a place where wild tobacco actually grew. The plant favors drier, rockier ground, and the nearest natural stands of it would have been at least 8 miles away, up in the surrounding foothills. Somebody had to walk out there, deliberately, find the plant, and carry it back to this exact fire. That alone tells you the seeds weren't an accident, blown in by wind or dropped by a passing animal. The other clue is just as telling. Tobacco seeds are famously bad at burning. They're small, dense, and don't catch fire easily, which makes them a strange thing to find charred in a hearth if someone was simply using the plant as firewood or as kindling. If you wanted to burn something for warmth, tobacco stems and seeds would be one of the worst choices available to you. Which leaves one main explanation. These people weren't burning tobacco by accident. They were almost certainly using it deliberately, for its effects, whether that meant chewing it, or more likely, given its position directly in the ashes of an active fire, smoking it. Before this specific find, the oldest confirmed evidence of human tobacco use anywhere in the world came from a set of smoking pipes discovered in Alabama, containing preserved traces of nicotine dated to around 3,300 years ago. The Utah discovery pushed that timeline back by roughly 9,000 years in one single find. 9,000 years from 4 small, unassuming burned seeds. Tobacco itself wasn't domesticated as a farmed crop until thousands of years later, with the earliest solid evidence for that coming from South America around 8,000 years ago, which means for at least 4,000 years before anyone was deliberately cultivating tobacco as a crop, people out in the Utah desert were already finding it in the wild, walking miles to gather it and using it around their fires, entirely on their own, with nobody teaching them, No established cultural tradition passed down from a farming society, just people encountering a plant, testing it, and clearly deciding it did something worth repeating. High in the Pamir Mountains, in what's now far western China, sits a place called Yerzhankal Cemetery. It's a strange, remote site, over 3,000 meters above sea level, marked by rings of stone and long black and white pebble strips laid across the landscape. Archaeologists excavating tombs there uncovered a set of wooden bowls, 10 of them in total, each one containing small stones that had clearly been exposed to intense heat. At first glance, these looked like they might simply be incense burners, a common enough funerary object. But when a research team led by archaeologist Yimin Yang ran a full chemical analysis on the burned residue clinging to those stones, they found something specific: strong chemical traces of cannabis, and not just any cannabis. The residue showed unusually high levels of a chemical marker for THC, the primary psychoactive compound in the plant. This distinction actually matters a lot because cannabis itself is one of the oldest cultivated plants in East Asia, grown for at least 6,000 years before this cemetery even existed, for its fiber and its oily seeds. That much had been known for a long time. Most of those older cultivated varieties, like most wild cannabis, naturally contained very low levels of THC, low enough that people who've tried smoking or eating those specific wild strains in modern experiments reported basically no psychoactive effect at all. There had even been earlier claims from other Central Asian sites suggesting ritual cannabis burning going back as far as 5,000 years. But when other researchers went back and tested those older samples more carefully, the THC levels turned out to be too low to have done anything. The cannabis at Yerzhankal was different. Whether through careful selection over generations or simply because of where and how these particular plants grew, they contained unusually potent levels of THC, closer to what you'd find in a deliberately selected psychoactive strain than in ordinary hemp. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials at around 500 BCE, roughly 2,500 years ago. The braziers were burned inside enclosed spaces, meaning anyone nearby would have directly inhaled the resulting smoke, not incidentally, but as the clear point of the ritual itself. And there's an almost eerie historical confirmation sitting right alongside the archaeology. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, just decades after these burials, described a very similar sounding ritual among people living in a nearby region. Mourners sitting inside a small tent, throwing cannabis onto hot stones and inhaling the resulting smoke as part of a funeral rite. Herodotus was writing about people hundreds of miles away from Yerzhankal, and for a long time, historians treated his account as a strange, possibly exaggerated travel story. The Yerzhankal excavation gave that old written account a physical, chemical match from actual burned residue, actual heated stones in an actual tomb. Isotope analysis on the skeletons buried at the site adds one more layer. Nearly a third of the individuals buried at Yerzhankal weren't originally from that immediate region at all. They were migrants, likely traveling along an early precursor to the Silk Road, the same trade network that would later connect China to the Middle East and Europe, which raises the real possibility that this remote, high-altitude cemetery wasn't just a place where this practice happened to occur, but an actual node, a literal crossroads, where the habit of deliberately inhaling psychoactive smoke could spread outward, carried by travelers, along one of the oldest long-distance trade routes on Earth. So here's what these three discoveries, spread across 2 continents and roughly 10,000 years, actually tell you together. In Utah, 12,300 years ago, it's tobacco found in a hearth, almost certainly smoked or chewed, entirely independent of any farming tradition. In the Ohio Valley, sometime between 4000 BC and the early centuries AD, that same casual habit becomes something formalized and ceremonial, carved into elaborate spirit animal pipes and buried directly with the honored dead. And in Western China, at almost exactly the same moment the Adena were carving those pipes, an entirely unconnected culture was burning cannabis specifically for its psychoactive smoke, tied to its own elaborate funeral ritual, likely spreading along early trade routes. 3 different plants, or in the Ohio case, one plant used 2 different ways, on 2 different continents, involving human populations who never had any contact with each other, arriving again and again at strikingly similar behavior. Take a plant that alters how your mind feels, set it on fire, and breathe in the result. Then, more often than not, treat that ritual as sacred enough to bury alongside your dead. Neither of these people needed a chemist to explain what nicotine or THC does to a human brain. They just needed the plant, a fire that was already burning for warmth or cooking anyway, and the simple, repeatable observation that inhaling this particular smoke did something noticeably different than inhaling ordinary wood smoke. That's really the through line connecting all 3 of these finds, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Humans, completely independently, kept discovering the exact same basic trick. Fire plus the right plant equals an altered state. And once discovered, no group that found it ever seems to have stopped. That side detail about tobacco seeds burning poorly and cannabis needing careful selection for higher THC actually points to something else worth sitting with. None of this was accidental. All 3 of these represent real, deliberate experimentation. People testing a specific plant, noticing an effect, and then crucially choosing to keep doing it, eventually building entire ritual structures and belief systems around it, elaborate and important enough to carve spirit animals into stone or bury the evidence directly alongside the dead. Tobacco eventually became one of the most economically and culturally significant plants in human history, driving trade, ritual, medicine, and eventually a massive global industry, all traceable back to wild plants first noticed by hunter-gatherers walking a marshy stretch of Ice Age Utah.